Welcome to the Birdwatching channel and this second in a series of programs about woodpeckers. I'm your host and fellow birdwatcher Sharon Sorensen. In part one, we took a look at what makes woodpeckers different from other songbirds. In part two, we'll focus on identifying 6 common woodpeckers in the Midwestern and Eastern United States. We're going to look at 6 common woodpeckers: the downy woodpecker, the hairy woodpecker, the red-bellied woodpecker, the red-headed woodpecker, the northern flicker, and the pileated woodpecker. We'll start with the downy woodpecker because he's the most common, the one you'd be most likely to have in your yard. He's also our smallest, at just under 6.5 inches long. Why is it called a downy woodpecker? That name comes from the fact that he has downy feathers at the base of his bill, and ornithologists believe that those feathers help protect the bird's eyes while he's hammering on the trees. The sexes are easily told apart. As you might guess, the male is the flashier of the two, so he has the red spot on the back of his head. The female does not. Otherwise, they look very much alike. Sometimes in June to maybe early July, you will see a downy woodpecker with red on top of his head. And that's a fledgling, a bird that has just left the nest. Here you see the female downy feeding or offering to feed that fledgling. And when that fledgling male molts into his adult plumage, the red will somehow miraculously move to the back of his head. I find that totally awesome. The female, of course, doesn't have the red. That takes us to the hairy woodpecker, and I know when you look at that bird you think, oh my gosh, it looks just like a downy woodpecker to me, and you're right, it does very closely resemble it. It's only slightly larger than the downy, but it is far less common. And so how do you know which one's larger if you can't see them side by side? And I can guarantee you that you rarely do. So the male hairy, like the male downy, has red on the back of his head, and the female, like the female downy, does not. The juvenile hairy woodpeckers, again, are very similar to the downy woodpeckers, and the male has red on the top of his head and the female does not. So let's try to look at some ways to figure out how to tell them apart other than size, since we can't compare them very readily. The downy's bill, from the tip of the bill to the base of the bill, is about half the length of the bird's head, from the base of the bill to the back of the head. On the other hand, the hairy, from the tip of the bill to the base of the bill, has a distance about equal to the base of the bill to the back of the head. So it does have a much longer bill, and you have an easy way to make the comparison. That doesn't always work. You don't always get to see the bill that clearly. So is there another way? You can take a look at the outer tail feathers. The outer tail feathers on a downy show black spots on the side, while on the hairy they're all white. So even though I can't see this bird's beak, I know it's a hairy. The downy has spots, but since you don't usually see it from the front, but rather hugging a tree, this may be a little trickier. The outer tail feathers do usually show spots on the side on the downy, while they don't on the hairy. But that kind of depends on the position of those feathers on the tail. They may be completely concealed. So you can also look at behavior. Downies feed on small branches, as you can see here. They even feed on weed stalks, cattails. I've seen them on corn stalks, and they move very acrobatically. The hairy, on the other hand, will never be on stalks. He's always on tree trunks and moves about much more heavily. Downies are also more social. They'll flock with other birds in the winter in foraging flocks looking for food. The hairy, no, he's a loner. So when you see this picture, it kind of illustrates the downy's social attitude. This young male is on the same stick as a female indigo bunting. Each knows the other's there, but they don't seem to care because they're friendly to each other. Their calls are also different, but this gets a little tricky as well. The Downy's call is a sharp peak while the Harry's is a low-pitched peak. And again, if they aren't heard side by side, how do you know which one's low-pitched? But the whinny call, and yes, think whinny like a horse, the whinny call descends at the end on a Downy, but it does not descend on the Harry. So it's possible that you could even hear a woodpecker, a Downy or a Hairy woodpecker, and know which it is without ever seeing it. That takes us to the red-bellied. It's larger than either the Hairy or the Downy, about a little over 9 inches long. It's sort of the medium size, and I take a look at this one because it's the next most logical one that you would have in your yard. It does tend to come frequently to feeders. So how did it get its name red belly when it seems to have a red head? Well, see that little wash of red on its belly? And again, the trick of it is that they have their bellies against the tree most of the time, so you need a better way to define it. And so think carefully about how the red appears on the red-bellied woodpecker's head. It goes from the back of the neck to the base of the upper bill. And the difference between the male is that his red goes all the way to the beak, while the female has a gray forehead. The juvenile, well, he has a little red on the top of his head, so it is going to be a male. But right now, I think only a mother could love. But keep in mind, it will be gorgeous in another few months when it gets its adult plumage. And that takes us now to the red-headed woodpecker. Some beginning birders often call that red-bellied woodpecker red-headed until you see this bird. Oh my goodness. Red hood from throat to lower bill, from the back of the head to the top of the upper bill. It's just as if he has on a solid red hood. And then he's either all black or all white on all the rest of his body. So while he's very similar in size to red belly, they are distinctively different. And get a load of that white bill. No other bird has a white bill. Isn't that awesome? So it's a stunning bird. The males and females look alike, which separates them from most other woodpeckers. And if you compare the red-bellied to the red-head, it's clear why they're named as they are. Notice also that the red-bellied has a black and white checkered back, while the red-headed has either all black or all white plumage in its spots. I think he looks as if he's wearing a tuxedo. The juvenile, not so handsome, but he will be eventually. And another look at this juvenile shows the difference on the white on the feathers. Notice that the white on the wing feathers includes some black, while an adult would not have that. Northern flickers range across the entire United States, but those to the west are called red-shafted, while those to the east are called yellow-shafted. They're larger than any of the others that we've looked at to date. They're about the size of a robin, but think really chunky robin. They're called yellow-shafted because of the veins, the heavy veins down the center of the feather. Those veins or shafts are yellow. And while it doesn't show when you see the bird from the back, it will show if you see him from the front or in flight. You often see this bird on the ground, which also separates a little bit from the others. Not that the others are never on the ground, but this one is more regularly on the ground than on a tree trunk. And he's there because he's been poking in the ground, and you can see the mud on his beak, looking for ants. Ants are the filet mignon to a northern flicker, so you will see them often on the ground. The male northern flicker and the female northern flicker both have red chevrons on the backs of their heads. They both have black bibs, but the male has a black mustache while the female doesn't. Well, of course the male has a mustache. That's an easy one to remember. The fledgling, yeah, well, he'll be pretty when he grows up, but it's obvious. Actually, I think this is going to be a female. The red is just showing on the chevron, and so it's possible that a mustache will show up, but notice that you can see the yellow shafts in this bird even at its young age. And that takes us to the pileated woodpecker. He is our largest woodpecker. He's the size of a crow. He's got a wingspan of 29 inches. I may have short arms, I don't know, but my arm isn't 29 inches long. So this is a big guy. This is the woody woodpecker. The male pileated woodpecker, like the red-bellied woodpecker, has red all the way to the top of his beak, while the female does not. But there's yet another way to separate the two, and that is that the male has a red mustache and the female doesn't have a mustache at all. So again, of course, the male has a mustache. The woody woodpecker is notorious, this pileated woodpecker, for drilling holes in trees. Big holes. I mean, not just a little bit of a hole, an inch or so in diameter, but huge holes. They sometimes shred an entire tree that is decayed. So this is a feeding cavity that he's working on here. The nest cavities tend to be more round. So that pileated, and don't be confused if you're used to calling it pileated, that's okay. Both pronunciations are correct, but I call it pileus because it's named for the pileus on the top of his head, the Latin word for that red crest. So if it's pileus, then it seems to me that he ought to be called pileated. But don't argue with anybody who wants to change it differently. It's not worth the argument. Both are acceptable. So there you have it. Those are the 6 common woodpeckers. Here's the male downy woodpecker. Here's the male hairy woodpecker with his much longer beak. Here is the male red-bellied woodpecker with his red belly just showing. Here is the red-headed woodpecker with his full red hood, having a little tiff with a red-bellied woodpecker on the right. And finally, the flicker with this case, no mustache, so the female. And ultimately, the biggest of them all, the pileated woodpecker with the red mustache on the male. So I hope you've enjoyed learning about 6 of the most common woodpeckers in the Midwestern and Eastern United States. And I hope you'll join us for part 3, attracting woodpeckers to your yard. To learn more about bird watching, there are 3 books that you may find of interest, all available at usual online sources. Or join me to take a look at the website or my Facebook page, where I try to post something almost every day about birds and bird habitat. Meanwhile, happy birding. May you always have birds in your binoculars.